You now know what evidence is, as well as the various types of evidence. Now let's focus on some of the general principles or suggestions for using that evidence, paying particular attention to specific instances, statistics, and testimony, and finally, where you can find evidence. What principles should you adhere to when you are using evidence, generally? Well, first and foremost, you need to be ethical, regardless of the type of evidence. That means that when you're using specific instances or examples, they should be representative. Look for the best example to prove the generalization, not the most out-of-the-way, atypical one. You don't want someone claiming that you are using an isolated example. In fact, if contradictory examples exist, acknowledge them. Use phrases like, not all cases, and this does not always occur, and of course there are exceptions. If you're using a hypothetical example, make it clear from the very beginning that it is just that, hypothetical. In 1980, Washington Post reporter Janet Cook published a story describing the life of an 8-year-old heroin addict named Jimmy, for which she was awarded a Pulitzer Prize. It was later discovered that no such person existed, but that she had created the story based upon what she thought could happen. Cook resigned from the Post and returned the prize, and this is a clear instance of an unethical use of a hypothetical example. Everything that you are using, testimony, specific instances, statistics, should come from credible and reliable sources. Look for the credibility of the source. Is it biased? Does the person have the proper credentials? Is no source even listed? Please note that even if the source is unbiased, if the source appears to be biased to the audience is likely to mistrust the evidence. For example, when the tobacco industry denies the dangers of smokeless tobacco, their testimony tends not to be trusted. When citing evidence, it is usually necessary to have current data. Thus, the date of the evidence is important. Information may change, even overnight. Another example. It wasn't that long ago that people were strongly advised to cut eggs out of their diet because eggs contain too much cholesterol. Today, the U.S. government's dietary guidelines allow an egg a day, claiming that today's eggs contain less cholesterol than those of a decade ago. Well, who knows? That data and the accompanying recommendations could change in the future. It should be clear that the data you cite should be the most current available. If you can't find a date, it might be time to question the evidence. Beyond considering ethics, you should also try to relate your evidence to the audience. Where possible, connect to shared experiences. Many of us can recall exactly where we were on September 11th, 2001, and all the feelings that we were experiencing at that time. You can connect with this shared experience, increasing the likelihood that your audience will accept what you have to say on a related subject. With students, I can reference homework deadlines, finals week, stress, etc. Conversely, avoid referencing experiences that audience cannot connect to. Many professors use examples that students have no connections with. I doubt that many of my students would understand a reference to Welcome Back, Kotter, which is an old television show. Again, consider your audience when using hypothetical examples. If not actually shared experiences, are the hypothetical examples even likely for this audience? Consider what sources that your audience might find believable. While Wikipedia is frowned upon in academic classes, it might actually be the best evidence for younger age groups. Consider the type of evidence for the audience. Perhaps statistics would work best for certain audiences, or personal narratives better for others. Match the type of evidence with the audience. And finally, mix them up. That means types of evidence as well as the sources of your evidence. Not only does this help relieve boredom, imagine, for example, a speech comprised solely of statistics, but if some of your evidence is questioned, you will have other sources or evidence that your audience is likely to accept. Now, when using specific instances, make sure you provide enough instances or examples to convince others. Usually that's more than one, and you should have more in reserve if you're questioned. You must also provide sufficient detail so that the instances seem real, even in the case of hypothetical examples. You start home from work and find yourself in the middle of a massive traffic jam. is a very vague hypothetical example and likely falls flat. However, you could add some more detail and say something like, 5 o'clock rolls around and it's quitting time for most of working Americans. You've got plans and you want to get home as soon as possible. You work downtown, so like thousands of other Americans, you hop on the freeway and away you go until some other driver blows a tire or runs out of gas. Now you, along with thousands of other irritated drivers, are stuck in a freeway parking lot. When you use terms like the best example of this is, or a typical example would be, or even let me offer you a hypothetical example, you are giving the value characteristics of specific instances. Turning to statistics, consider the methodology of the statistics that you're using. This includes sample size. If you say 50% of voters favor a ballot initiative, is that 50% of 100 people interviewed, or of 1,000 people interviewed, or of 2? How representative is the sample? Are we talking about registered voters, people over 18, or just people in general? Can the resulting data then be generalized? What was the methodology of the study? Might it have been flawed? Statistics really don't make sense unless they are compared with other statistics or connected to the audience. One of my graduate professors suggested the double I, that statistics should have impact and intelligibility. We hear numbers all of the time, but they have no impact on us, and we typically have difficulty even understanding them. As an example, at my last check, the U.S. federal deficit is close to $700 billion. That's a big number, but what does it really mean? In August of 2013, the South Florida Sun-Sentinel estimated that $700 billion could buy braces for everyone in France and Britain, or 2 cups of Starbucks every day for a year for every person in Brazil, or gasoline for a year for every adult in America. Really makes that $7 billion number more impactful and intelligible, doesn't it? When you are using testimony as evidence, you'll want to make sure that you keep the audience in mind. Match the source with the audience. And in this case, we could be talking about magazines and newspapers as well as people. What sources would that audience find to be credible and reliable? Different audiences will have different perceptions of a source's credibility. You should know the qualifications of the source, and in fact, oftentimes you'll need to qualify the source for the audience, particularly if the audience does not know the source. If I were to cite Sandra Harris, for example, on the subject of photography, you might not think that Sandra Harris is a credible person. In fact, who is Sandra Harris? Until I qualify her as saying that she is a professional photographer and former president of the Professional Photographers of California, the Professional Photographers of Sacramento, and member of the board for the Professional Photographers of America. You'll also want to maintain good records. That means that you want to have the exact wording of the quote available, even if you paraphrase. You want to be able to prove, if pressed, that you are not taking that testimony out of context. Related to that, knowing the context means also knowing the date, when this statement was delivered. This again relates back to having the most credible and reliable and current data available. You can find evidence in a variety of places. Many people forget that artifacts are evidence, and those artifacts, those things, could literally be found anywhere. Let's say you believe that you have rats in your garage. You would look around for evidence of those rats. Not testimony, not statistics, but rat droppings, or the rats themselves. Those would all be evidence. However, in academic research, we tend to look for evidence in print, online, interviews, and personal experience. Realize that as technology advances, it's difficult to classify books, encyclopedias, and the like as print media, because many of them can be found online, and often in their entirety. Similarly, an interview can be conducted in person, published in a printed source or online, or televised. Regardless, it's important to consider the advantages and disadvantages of each source of evidence. For example, books are often great sources of evidence because they can address topics in significant detail as compared to newspapers and magazines who often have to edit down the content to fit in a few pages or a few column inches. However, traditional books take so long to get to print that they're often out of date before they're even published. Even magazines, whether they be print or online, have long lead time for publication. Articles about winter holiday topics that appear in December issues are typically submitted for consideration of publication during the summer. So each source of evidence comes with its own set of advantages and disadvantages. In many cases, such as an academic debate, it is important to select a source of evidence based upon its accessibility to others. For example, if you quote a testimony from your personal physician, I can't easily verify if you quoted her correctly or not. I can more easily find a quote from the U.S. Surgeon General that was printed in a newspaper. Those records are much more readily accessible. Standard web pages change frequently. What was online yesterday may have disappeared today, which is why hard copies, screenshots, or downloads are often required as evidence. Well, they are actually artifacts to prove the evidence that you're citing really exists. Processing time. Is it really necessary to consider when evidence was gathered? How important do you think it is to relate your evidence to your audience? How many examples should you use to support your points? And how important is it for you to make your statistics understandable to your audience? Just remember that when you are supporting an argument with evidence, strive to use the best evidence possible, even if it takes time, because it's usually worth the effort.